Chapter 4 LCHE. The heroic guerrilla warrior. When they finally reached the Cuban coastline near Cape Cruz, it was beginning to get light. The landing spot they had chosen was near the coastal town of Niquero, in what was then called Orient Province. Waiting for them, there was Celia Sanchez, who was one of the founders of the 26th of July movement and a key member of the clandestine network in Santiago de Cuba, the main city of Orient Province. She was waiting for them with some vehicles, food, weapons, and about 50 men who were ready to join with Fidel Castro's group to attack and capture Niquero, and then the neighboring town of Manzanillo. A few days earlier, on November 30, 1956, the naval station and police station in Santiago de Cuba, the largest city in the region, had been attacked by the 26th of July movement. This attack was a diversionary tactic to draw the army and police away from the area where the Granma expedition was supposed to land. But when the Granma arrived off the coast of Orient Province on the morning of December 2, 1956, it was running out of fuel and was 2 days behind schedule. Fidel and his men were forced to beach the ship at a spot called Playa de los Colorados, near the village of Las Coloradas, about 15 miles south of the designated landing spot. The exact spot where they beached the boat was a muddy 70 CheGuevara mangrove swamp, and they were unable to unload most of their heavy weapons. The guerrillas were forced to abandon their heavy equipment and most of their supplies and make their way to land by wading through the muddy marsh. The following is Fidel Castro's account of this critical moment in the history of the Cuban Revolution. On 2 occasions, the skipper at the helm of the Granma, a former Cuban Navy commander who had joined our movement, tried to follow the correct route through the labyrinth marked by the boys, and on 2 occasions he came back to the point of departure. He was trying a 3rd time. It was impossible to keep up this exasperating search. There were only a few liters of fuel left. It was already broad daylight. The enemy was relentlessly searching by sea and by air. The boat was in grave danger of being destroyed a few kilometers off the coast, with all of the forces on board. We could see the coast nearby, and the waters were apparently shallow. The skipper was ordered to head straight for this spot, full steam ahead. The Granma ran into mud and stopped 60 meters from shore. The men disembarked with their weapons and struggled through the water over soft mud that threatened to swallow them up as they were overloaded. Castro 2121. But as soon as they reached what had seemed to be the solid shore, they encountered mud again. They found themselves in a long, swampy coastal lagoon that stretched between their point of arrival and the solid land beyond. According to Castro, it took almost 2 hours to cross that hellish swamp. Having just reached solid ground, the FARST heavy weaponry shots were heard firing at the landing point, near the now solitary Granma. Its presence had been sighted and communicated to the enemy command, which immediately responded with a sea attack on the expedition and machine gun ning from the air of the area, to which the small expeditionary force of 82 men was headed. Castro 2122. Fortunately, the mangrove thickets through which they were making their way protected them from being seen from the air. For several days, they marched toward the neighbor LCHE 71 in Sierra Maestra, Cuba's largest mountain range, by hiding during the day and marching during the night. At FARST, they did not encounter any resistance, but on December 5, they were surprised by a large detachment of the army near a sugarcane field at a place called Alegria de Pio, where they had stopped to rest. Because they had eaten and drunk very little since their departure from Mexico and were exhausted from the ordeal of their landing and several days of nighttime marching, they were completely unprepared to defend themselves and ran in all directions to try and save themselves. The tragic outcome of this encounter with Batista's forces is described by Fidel Castro as follows: a surprise enemy attack in a light forest where we were waiting for nightfall to continue the march to the Sierra Maestra. A terrible setback, total dispersion, a tenacious search and persecution of the scattered men, an enormous cost in the lives of combatants, the vast majority of them murdered after falling prisoner, almost all the weapons lost. Only Guevara, Fidel and Raul Castro, and 12 others escaped and made their way to the Sierra Maestra. Guevara was wounded in the neck, but his wound was not serious since the bullet ricocheted off a cartridge case in his chest pocket. He survived, but with only the most rudimentary medical treatment because he had left his medical knapsack ad alegria de Pio. In one of the essays, he later wrote and published in Passages de la Guerra Revolucionaria, Episodes of the Revolutionary War, Guevara described his baptism of fiery ad alegria de Pio as follows. Perhaps this was the fire resty time I was faced with the dilemma of choosing between my devotion to medicine and my duty as a revolutionary soldier. There at my feet was a knapsack full of medicine and a box of ammunition. I couldn't possibly carry both of them. They were too heavy. I picked up the box of ammunition, leaving the medicine, and started to cross the clearing, heading toward the cane Phi Eld. I remember Faustino Perez, kneeling and firing his submachine gun. Near me, a compañero named Emilio Albentosa was walking toward the cane Phi Eld. A burst of gunfire hit us both. I felt a sharp blow on my chest and a wound in my neck, and I thought for certain I was dead. Albentosa, vomiting blood and bleeding profusely from a deep wound made by a .45 caliber bullet, shouted, "They've killed me," and began to fire his rifle at no one in particular. Deutschmann 1997-26. 72, CheGuevara, while he was lying alone on the ground waiting to die. Guevara was approached by one of members of the group who urged him to get up and go with him into the nearby cane Phi Eld, where they encountered two other men. According to Guevara's account of this situation, Juan Almeida approached, urging me to go on, and despite the intense pain, I dragged myself into the cane Phi Eld. Then everything became a blur of airplanes FL Yinglo and Straffi NG the Phi Eld. With Almeida leading, we crossed the last path among the rows of cane and reached the safety of the woods. The Phi RSD shouts of fire were heard in the cane Phi Eld, and call-ums of FL aim and smoke began to rise. We walked until the darkness made it impossible to go on, and decided to lie down and go to sleep all huddled together in a heap. We were starving and thirsty, and the mosquitoes added to our misery. This was our baptism of fire on December 5, 1956, in the outskirts of Nequero. Such was the beginning of forging what would become the rebel army. Page 27. Meanwhile, back in Mexico, Hilda and Hildita had moved out of their apartment and into the home of one of Hilda's friends. According to the plans she and Chi had made before his departure. As soon as she saw news of the expedition's invasion of Cuba in the newspapers, she and Hildita were to leave for Peru, where they would await the outcome of the revolutionary struggle. If this struggle succeeded, they were to join him in Cuba, stay there for a while, and then decide whether to go to Peru or Argentina to continue the Phi GHT. Since it was Chi's intention to continue Phi GHting in other countries of Latin America. Guerrilla 2008, 208. On December 2, 1956, the news of Fidel Castro's expedition was published in all the Mexico City newspapers. The Phi RSD headline Hilda saw read, "Invasion of Cuba by boat, Fidel Castro, Ernesto Guevara, Raúl Castro, and all other members of the expedition dead." Page 209. She was shocked and overwhelmed with grief, but some of her friends cautioned her to wait for confirmation of this bad news. They said both the Cuban and Mexican government authorities were most likely spreading false information to the press to discourage people from supporting Castro's cause. General Bayo visited Hilda and told her he didn't believe what the newspapers were reporting. In fact, he told her he was sure Guevara was alive. He said, "I can tell you this. He's the most intel LCHE 73 ligent, the cleverest, the one who most profited from my instruction. I am sure nothing has happened to him." Page 210. Then Guevara's father called Hilda from Argentina to say he had contacted one of his cousins, who was the Argentine ambassador in Cuba. He said his cousin told him his son was not among the dead, the wounded, or the prisoners taken by the Cuban authorities. Still not knowing for sure whether he was alive or dead, Hilda followed the plan they had made before the departure of the expedition. She left Mexico with Hildita to go stay with her parents in Lima, Peru. After staying there for a few weeks, they both went to Argentina at the invitation of Guevara's parents. Just before they left for Argentina, she received a call from his father, who informed her they had received word that Ernesto was alive. The Phi RSD letter that Hilda received from Guevara was dated January 28, 1957, Guerrilla 2008, 216. It provides an excellent summary of his baptism of fire and his Phi RSD days on Cuban soil. In this letter, he wrote, As you probably know, after 7 days of being packed like sardines in the now famous Granma, we landed at a dense, rotting mangrove jungle through the pilot's error. Our misfortunes continued until finally we were surprised in the also now famous Alegria de Pio and scattered like pigeons. He said he had been wounded in the neck, but he survived due to my cat's lives. He explained to her that a machine gun bullet hit a cartridge case in my chest pocket, and the bullet ricocheted and nicked my neck. For a few days, I walked through those hills thinking I was seriously wounded because the bullet had banged my chest so hard. He also described in this letter how his group managed to survive. Our group, including Almeida and Ramirito, whom you know, spent 7 days of hunger and terrible thirst until we were able to slip through the cordon and, with help from the peasants, get back to rejoin Fidel. What he undoubtedly knew, but did not want to reveal to his wife, when he wrote this letter was that, of the 82 members of the Granma expedition, most were killed or caught and then dared by the Cuban army in the 5 Resti days, after the guerrilla force landed in Orient Province. Besides Guevara and the Castro brothers, there were only 12 other survivors. As he hinted in his letter to Hilda, among those who were killed was Nico Lopez, his friend since Guatemala days. 74 CheGuevara, the survivors of the Granma expedition, were joined by 6 discontented peasants in January 1957, and this minuscule group began operating as a guerrilla force from hiding places in the Sierra Maestra. Their 5 Resti victory was an attack on a small army garrison on the coast where the La Plata River comes down out of the Sierra Maestra to the ocean. As Guevara later wrote about this attack, the effect of our victory was electrifying and went far beyond that craggy region. It was like a clarion call, proving that the rebel army really existed and was ready to fight GHT. Deutschmann, 1997-28. At this time, they had only 22 weapons, and they were short of ammunition. He wrote they had to take the garrison, at all costs, for a failure would have meant expending all our ammunition, leaving us practically defenseless. On January 16, 1957, they observed the garrison from the distance and took prisoner the drunken foreman of a local plantation who gave them information about the garrison. Under the cover of darkness, they attacked the garrison's small buildings from the left, center, and right. Guevara was in the group that attacked from the center. At great risk and under heavy fire, he and another man got close enough to set one of the 3 buildings on fire. Intimidated by the fire, the soldiers gave up the GHT and surrendered. As a result, the guerrillas were able to seize their weapons, ammunition, fuel, food, and clothing. While none of the guerrillas received even a scratch in the GHT, they killed 2 of the soldiers, wounded 5 and took 3 prisoners. The rest of the soldiers fled into the night. After attending to the wounded, the guerrillas set fire to the barracks and withdrew into the Sierra Maestra. Page 32. According to Guevara, their humane treatment of prisoners was in open contrast to that of Batista's army. He wrote, "Not only did they kill our wounded, they abandoned their own. This difference made a great impact on the enemy over time, and it was a factor in our victory." As the months went by, the guerrillas carried out a number of daring attacks against small military outposts in the region. They were able to do this with the help they received from the 26th of July movement's clandestine urban network of supporters in Santiago de Cuba, led by Frank Pais and Celia Sanchez. This network sent men, arms, ammunition, and food to the rebel army. Castro assigned Guevara to be the liaison between this urban underground network and the guerrilla force. In March 1957, Guevara guided a group of over 50 men that Frank Pais LCHE 75 had recruited and sent to join the guerrilla force in the Sierra Maestra. By April 1957, the guerrilla force totaled some 80 men. The news of their actions began to attract the support of local peasants and the members of other political groups that were opposed to the Batista dictatorship all over the country. The ranks of the guerrilla force began to swell with recruits from these groups, the local peasantry, and the urban supporters of the 26th of July movement in the cities of Santiago, Bayamo, Guantanamo, and Manzanillo. Guevara was to have been the medical officer of the revolutionary guerrilla force, but his value as a guerrilla leader soon became evident. According to Fidel Castro, Che distinguished himself and won the admiration of his comrades at the second encounter, their small guerrilla force had with the army on May 28, 1957. This battle took place in El Uvero, a small village along the road from Niquero to Santiago de Cuba. In this battle, the guerrillas actually outnumbered the army by 80 to 53, Bonachia and San Martin 1974-95. They took the army unit by surprise, and in an exchange of gunfire that lasted almost 3 hours, they killed 14 soldiers and wounded 19 before the remaining soldiers surrendered. Their own losses were 7 dead and 9 wounded. Guevara cited this battle to be one of the most important of the Revolutionary War. He wrote later that, for us, it was a victory that meant our guerrillas had reached full maturity. From this moment on, our morale increased enormously, our determination and hope for victory also increased, and though the months that followed were a hard test, we now had the key to the secret of how to beat the enemy. Guevara 1963-72. Using the element of surprise, they were now strong enough to encircle most enemy units and force them to surrender or flee under the threat of complete annihilation. According to Guevara, after El Uvero, the relationship of forces in the Sierra Maestra began to shift greatly in favor of the rebel army, and the government's forced evacuation of peasants from the area resulted in 1,000 crimes, robberies, and abuses against them. However, as he noted, the peasants responded with renewed support to the cause of the July 26 movement, and the guerrillas' fair treatment toward the peasantry, respecting their property, paying for what we consumed, tending their sick, helping those most in need, was the total opposite of the government's bestial policy. 76 CheGuevara. By this point, Guevara's bravery and military prowess had impressed and won over his Cuban comrades. As Castro later wrote, from the very arrestee moment, he was absolutely willing to give his life, regardless of whether it was in the arrestee battle or the second or the third. Here we had a person born in a place thousands of kilometers from our country. But for that country and that cause, he was the arrestee at every moment to volunteer for something dangerous, for a mission with great risks. Page 105. Castro described Guevara's role in El Uvero as follows. In a practically individual battle with an enemy soldier, in the midst of general combat, he shot the adversary and crawled forward under a hail of bullets to take his weapon. And it earned him the admiration of all. Deutschman 1994-102. According to Castro, Che was one of those people who was liked immediately for his simplicity, his character, his naturalness, his calm, raidly attitude, his personality, his originality, even when one had not yet learned of his other unique qualities. Castro 1994-68. Initially, as the guerrilla force's only doctor, he established a special bond with the other members of the small force. But in the force's second victorious battle, as Castro has stated, he became the most outstanding soldier in that battle, carrying out for the arrestee time one of those singular feats that characterized him in all military action. Page 69. In subsequent battles, according to Castro, he was outstanding as both combatant and doctor, caring for wounded comrades as well as wounded enemy soldiers. In one case during the early months of the guerrilla forces campaign in the Sierra Maestra, Guevara stayed behind with the wounded after the rest of force abandoned the scene of a bloody encounter with the army. Castro's account of this occasion is as follows. After all the weapons had been captured, and it became necessary to abandon that position, undertaking a long return march under the harassment of various enemy forces, someone had to stay behind with the wounded, and it was Che who did so. Aided by a small group of our soldiers, he took care of them, saved their lives, and later rejoined the column with them. Page 70. As Castro's account reveals, from this time forward, he stood out as a capable and valiant leader, one of those who, when a difficult mission is pending, do not wait to be asked to carry it out. Indeed, his willingness to instantly volunteer for the most difficult missions aroused admiration, twice the usual admiration. According to Castro, since he was so 77 altruistic, so selfless, so willing to always do the most difficult things, and to constantly risk his life. Because of how he distinguished himself in combat, and because he had won the respect and admiration of his comrades, Castro gave Guevara increasingly greater military responsibilities. In March 1957, he appointed him, along with Ramiro Valdez, Ciro Redondo, and Camilo Cienfuegos, to the rank of captain. And a few months later, on July 21, 1957, Castro appointed Guevara as comandante, commander or major, the highest rank in the guerrilla army, which was held at the time only by Fidel Castro himself, page 70. In addition, Fidel placed Guevara at the head of a new guerrilla column, with instructions to operate apart from the main force. It was called the Dispossessed Peasants, and consisted of 3 platoons. This force numbered close to 75 men who, Guevara said, made him feel very proud. Despite their being heterogeneously dressed and armed, page 38. Guevara's own account of how Castro appointed him commander, and how he received his commander's star, is worth noting here. In episodes of the Revolutionary War, he wrote the following account. "We wrote a letter of congratulations and appreciation to Carlos, the underground name of Frank Pais, who was living his final days. It was signed by all the officers of the guerrilla army who knew how to write. Many of the Sierra peasants were not very skilled in this art, but were already an important component of the guerrillas. The signatures appeared in 2 columns, and as we were riding down the ranks on the second one, when my turn came, Fidel simply said, 'Make it commander.' Thus, in a most informal manner, almost in passing, I was promoted to commander of the 2nd column of the guerrilla army." Guevara also noted in this account, "There is a bit of vanity hiding somewhere within every one of us. It made me feel like the proudest man in the world that day." And he added, "My insignia, a small star, was given to me by Celia Sanchez, who was present on this important occasion, page 38. This star, which he wore on the front of his black beret, soon became an important feature of his now legendary iconic image. A few days later, on July 30, 1957, Frank Pais, who was only 23 years old at the time, was killed by Batista's police as he left the house where he was hiding in Santiago. Unaware that Pais had been killed, the next day Guevara's column attacked a small army post in the Sierra Maestra 78 CheGuevara town of Buecito, Bonachia, and San Martin 1974-96. In this attack, they again caught soldiers at a post by surprise and wounded 6 of them. However, one of the members of Guevara's column was killed, and 3 others were wounded in the attack. As they left the town, one of the local miners decided to join them. He later became a well-known comandante in the rebel army. When they returned to their base in the mountains, they heard the news of Frank Pais's death. Guevara later wrote that the death of Pais represented an enormous loss to the revolution, since he was one of the purest, most brilliant figures of the Cuban Revolution. As a result of Pais's death, there were mass public protests in both Santiago and Havana, and the government responded with complete censorship of the press, as well as the arrest and murder of a large number of the urban supporters of the 26th of July movement. Guevara wrote, "When Frank Pais was murdered, we lost one of our most valuable fighters, but the people's reaction to the crime showed that additional forces were joining the struggle, and the people's fighting spirit had increased." Guevara 1963-96. In 1957, Guevara's column spent August in a small valley called El Hombrito near the summit of the Sierra Maestra. Since his column was composed of a large number of new recruits, they had to be trained, but they also had to be ready for battle at any moment. According to Guevara, it was their duty to attack any enemy units that dared invade what they called the Free Territory of Cuba, which at this time was a relatively small section of the Sierra Maestra, page 97. On August 29, a local peasant informed them that a large number of soldiers were headed their way on the trail that led to the valley where they were camped. Guevara had his men take up positions along the trail, so they could ambush the soldiers when they reached a curve where the trail made an almost 90-degree turn around a rock. His plan was to let 10 or 12 soldiers go by the rock and then open fire on them. His men were supposed to then take the dead soldiers' weapons and withdraw while they were being covered by their rear guard. However, when the soldiers came to the rock, one of his men opened fire too soon, and they succeeded in wounding only one of the soldiers at the head of the army column. Nevertheless, in the exchange of gunfire that followed, they managed to force the soldiers, who were equipped with bazookas, to retreat. LCHE 79, as Guevara noted in his episodes of the Revolutionary War. Page 100. This encounter with a large army unit of some 180 men proved that it was relatively easy for the guerrillas to attack large enemy columns on the march, since they could ambush and fire on the head of the enemy's approaching column and immobilize the rest of the column. In his account of this battle, Guevara wrote, "We continued this practice until it became an established system, so efficient that the soldiers stopped coming to the Sierra Maestra and even refused to be part of the advance guard." He added that, of course, it took more than one battle for our system to materialize. Moreover, he noted his guerrilla force was quite satisfied with these small victories at the time this battle took place, since they were still a poorly prepared, small guerrilla force that had only light weapons to confront well-equipped army units. On November 4, 1957, the FI-RSD issue of El Cubano Libre, the Free Cuban, the newspaper of the rebel army, was published by Guevara in the Sierra Maestra. The choice of this name for the newspaper had considerable historical significance, since El Cubano Libre was the name of the paper published by Cuban patriots during the independence wars against Spanish colonialism in the 19th century. A few months later, Guevara was also instrumental in creating the rebel army's clandestine radio station Radio Rebelda, which began its transmissions in February 1958 by stating it was broadcasting from the Free Territory of Cuba. Soon, Radio Rebelda began regularly broadcasting news of the rebel army's actions, as well as the declarations of the 26th of July movement, speeches by Castro, Cuban political news, and coded messages from the movement's members to their loved ones. It subsequently also provided radio communications between the rebel columns operating in different parts of the island. Guevara was the main proponent of establishing this clandestine radio station. He had been impressed by the role that the CIA-backed radio station, La Voz de la Liberación, the Voice of Liberation, had played in the overthrow of the Arbenz government in Guatemala, more 1993. Radio Rebelda, with its trademark salutation, Aquí Radio Rebelda here, still broadcasts today in Cuba. During April and early May 1958, Castro had Guevara take charge of creating a training school for the new recruits that were joining the rebel army in increasing numbers. They were put through a lengthy CheGuevara political, physical, and military training program similar to the training the Granma Group underwent in Mexico. Castro and Guevara wanted only the toughest and most dedicated recruits to join the rebel army, and they used the training program to weed out the weaker recruits. Castro also gave Guevara the responsibility for defending the western sector of the territory held by the rebel army against the full-scale offensive launched against it by the Batista government's armed forces at the end of May 1958. This offensive was undertaken by a force of some 15,000 troops. They were armed with mortars and bazookas and supported by tanks and aircraft. Their strategy was to encircle and annihilate the rebel army. They divided into 3 combat battalions, which attacked Castro's guerrilla forces from 3 different directions. The guerrillas fell back to the defensive positions they had prepared in the Sierra Maestra and ambushed the army battalions as they tried to advance. The fight sting was intense, and the guerrillas had to give up much territory, but the government forces failed to defeat the rebel army. The government forces launched their last major attack on the rebel army on June 28, 1958, using 2 battalions of troops that were camped at the Estrada Palma sugar mill at the base of the Sierra Maestra. Bachmann, 1984. As these troops advanced into the mountain using a single road, they were attacked by units of the rebel army under Guevara's command when they had gone only a few miles. Guevara's units ambushed and pinned down the lead battalion, which called up armored cars to clear the way ahead of them. As the armored cars advanced, they ran into minefields Guevara's troops had planted on both sides of the road. Several armored cars were destroyed or disabled by the mines, and soldiers began to panic and retreat as they came under increasing sniper fire from Guevara's sharpshooters. The retreat of the troops in the FI-RSD battalion turned into a rout when they saw that the 2nd Battalion was not coming to their relief. As both of the army battalions withdrew in a disorganized manner, Guevara's guerrillas moved in on them from the sides and cut them to ribbons. In total, the army suffered 86 casualties, whereas Guevara's force had only 3 casualties. Guevara's force also captured a large number of weapons and 18,000 rounds of ammunition. Bachmann 1984. LCHE 81. By mid-July 1958, the guerrilla forces of the rebel army had taken the initiative away from Batista's increasingly demoralized and battered troops. In fact, during the FARREST 11 days of combat in July, the guerrillas captured over 200 of Batista's soldiers, who were no match for the guerrilla fighters of the rebel army in the rugged terrain of the Sierra Maestra. By this point, it was clear the offensive was a failure, and it became a tremendous propaganda victory for Castro's forces. Over 1,000 of the government soldiers were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. The rebel army turned over approximately 450 prisoners to the Red Cross. As Guevara later wrote, Batista's army came out of that last offensive in the Sierra Maestra with its spine broken. Deutschmann 51. The Battle of Las Mercedes at the end of July and the beginning of August 1958 was the last significant battle of the Batista government's summer 1958 offensive against the rebel army. Bachmann 1984. This battle started out as a trap designed to lure the columns under Castro's command into a place where they could be surrounded and destroyed by a much larger force. As the battle began, the Cuban army general in charge of the offensive called on special reinforcements that he had stationed nearby to move into the area and trap Castro's guerrilla columns. Bachmann 1984. The reinforcements, a force of some 500 troops, started heading toward the area where Castro's columns were engaged in Las Mercedes with other units under the general's command. Castro realized his forces were in a precarious position, and he called on Guevara's column to come to their aid. Guevara had the ability to see in his mind's eye the whole battlefield in any given encounter. He quickly figured out the army's plan and saw that Castro's columns could be saved from disaster only if the army reinforcements heading toward the area were prevented from reaching the scene. As a result, Guevara ordered his men to ambush these troops and keep them from reaching the scene of the battle. His men succeeded in blocking the advance of the army reinforcements. They inflicted serious casualties on the advancing troops and took about 50 prisoners. This action allowed Castro's columns to slip out of the trap set for them by the army. Years later, Major Larry Bachman of the U.S. Marine Corps Command and Staff College analyzed Guevara's tactics during this battle, and he concluded they were brilliant. Bachmann 1984. The action taken by 82 Guevara's column kept the Las Mercedes battle from resulting in Castro's death or capture by the government's forces, having turned Batista's offensive into a guerrilla victory and a major propaganda success. The rebel army was able to attract widespread political support. On July 20, the leaders of the Cuban political parties opposing the Batista regime, both moderates and conservatives, signed a declaration in Caracas, called the Caracas Pact, in which they threw their support behind the 26th of July movement and the rebel army. Now the rebel army went on the offensive with the strategy of carrying out a three-pronged attack on Santiago de Cuba in the east, the cities in Las Villas province in the center of the country, and the province of Pinar del Rio at the western end of the island. The key to the success of this strategy was the campaign to divide the country in two by taking control of Las Villas province. In August 1958, Castro gave Guevara instructions to lead 2 columns down from the Sierra Maestra to the plains of Camagüey and then march toward Las Villas, where they would cut the country in half and block the movement of troops from Havana to the eastern half of the island. Guevara took the lead of one of the 2 columns, and Camilo Cienfuegos headed the other. They took separate routes through Camagüey province toward Las Villas. Cienfuegos's column headed for the northern portion of Las Villas, with instructions to establish a base of operations around the small town of Yaguaje. From there, his column was to head toward Pinar del Rio at the western end of the island. Guevara's column had instructions to establish a base of operations in the Escambray Mountains in the southern portion of Las Villas. The mission of his column was to convince the various small guerrilla groups operating there to join forces with his column and tie down the government troops in the central portion of the island, so they could not reinforce the army units that were being attacked by the rebel armies on two fronts, led by Fidel and Raul Castro, in Orient Province. Guevara and his men made the march from the Sierra Maestra in Orient Province on foot and on horses over difficult terrain, crossing Ooded rivers and streams caused by a hurricane at the beginning of September. He described this march as follows: days of tiring marches through desolate expanses where there was only water and mud. We were hungry, thirsty, and could hardly advance because our legs were LCHE 83 as heavy as lead, and the weapons were enormously heavy. Deutschmann 53. As Guevara's column moved across the plains of Camagüey toward Las Villas, it was subjected to constant attacks from Batista's army and air force. Guevara wrote, "Despite the difficulties, we were never without the encouragement of the peasants, who served as their guides or gave them food, without which they could not have had the strength to go on." Page 54. They escaped the ambushes and airstrikes and won one battle after another. Moreover, the almost suicidal character of their maneuvers against the regular army units they encountered seriously demoralized the government's forces. Meanwhile, Cienfuegos's column outmaneuvered and slipped past the army units in their path and made its way to Yaguaje. Guevara's column made its way through Camagüey province, and on October 16, 1958, they swam across the Juquero River, which divides the provinces of Camagüey and Las Villas. In order to slip through the encirclement the army had set up to trap them. Within a few days, they arrived safely in the Escambray Mountains, thanks to the tactical skills and leadership provided by Guevara. He convinced the 5E groups of guerrillas already operating in the Cambray Mountains to join with his men in attacking the army garrisons in the center of the province. To achieve this objective, Guevara had to convince the leaders of these independent organizations to join forces with his column. In referring to this accomplishment, he later wrote, "After laborious talks I had with their respective leaders, we reached a sea-rise of agreements, and it was possible to go on to form a more or less common front." Deutschmann 57. This common front was an extremely important achievement in the struggle to create revolutionary unity among the various groups fighting the Batista government. From the Cambray Mountains, they were able to harass the Batista dictatorship's armed forces and their communications network in Las Villas province. In a desperate attempt to shore up his shaky regime, Batista tried to stage a rigged national election in November 1958, but Castro called on the population to abstain from participating in the elections and/or dared his forces to disrupt the elections. The election was boycotted by a majority of the citizenry and by all the political parties that had signed the Caracas Pact. The public's repudiation of the rigged election so 84 CheGuevara infuriated Batista that he launched an unprecedented reign of police terror against the general populace. The guerrillas took this as the cue to begin their general offensive to bring down the dictatorship. It was in the Escambray Mountains that Guevara met Aleida March, whom he later married, after divorcing Hilda Gadia. March was a schoolteacher in Santa Clara who joined the local branch of the 26th of July movement in 1956. March 2008, 37. She subsequently served as a clandestine arms courier, saboteur, and messenger for the movement throughout Las Villas province. In late October 1958, the leadership of the movement in the province gave her money to take to Guevara's guerrilla force in the Escambray Mountains. She had orders to stay on with Guevara's force because it would be too dangerous for her to return to her previous activities. In her FI-RSD meeting with Guevara, she gave him 50,000 pesos that she had strapped to her body. Page 59. She told him she had been ordered to place herself under his command because the Batista authorities were hunting for her, and she knew too much about the movement's clandestine network to be captured by the authorities. At FI-RSD, Guevara refused to grant her request to join his column as a combatant and suggested she stay at the column's base camp as a nurse. She argued that she had spent the last 2 years working clandestinely for the movement, and that this experience gave her the right to be a guerrilla fighter and not a nurse. Pages 60-61. He compromised by asking her to serve as his personal secretary. Page 71. After his column had fought its way across the province to the provincial capital in Santa Clara, he gave her an M1 rifle and told her she had earned it. This gesture made her feel that he regarded her as a true combatant, no different in this respect than any of the other members of his column. Page 85. During November and December 1958, Guevara's column and Cienfuegos's column, aided by their allies from the Escambray Mountains, carried out a series of lightning attacks that captured most of the towns, closed the highways, and blocked the railroad lines throughout Las Villas province. Although they were subjected to constant aerial attacks from Batista's air force, and they often faced much larger forces with tanks and heavy weapons, they managed to outmaneuver, demoralize, and defeat their opponents in almost every encounter. As a result of their successful campaign to rapidly seize most of the towns and strategic points in the LCHE 85 province, they ended up in control of over 3,000 square miles of territory in a period of a few weeks, and they prevented the government from sending troops to Orient Province except by air and sea. They followed a strategy of launching surprise attacks on the garrisons of the Army and Rural Guard units in the towns and smaller cities of the province. They would surround barracks or forts and then force them to surrender after cutting off their supplies and threatening to set fire to, or in some cases actually setting fire to, the buildings government forces occupied. The guerrillas promised to release them after they surrendered if they would hand over all their weapons and ammunition, would listen to a lecture about the goals of the revolution, and agreed to leave the province immediately. In some cases, the guerrillas released them to the Red Cross, which then escorted them out of the province. As the news of these surrenders spread throughout the province, the local population offered them increasing support and assistance. At the end of December 1958, the decisive battle of the Revolutionary War was fought by Guevara's column and his allies in Santa Clara, the largest city in Las Villas province. Santa Clara was the transportation and communications hub of Las Villas and possessed approximately 150,000 inhabitants at the time. It had a railroad station, an airport, and television and radio stations. Guevara's force, outnumbered 9-1, faced a force of some 200 soldiers, rural guards, and police, Tabo 1996, 304. This force had superior weaponry, tanks, armored personnel carriers, mortars, bazookas, cannons, and an armored train, was supported by the Air Force, and occupied the hills surrounding the city as well as its tallest buildings. Guevara, on the other hand, had a force under his command that totaled only 214 combatants. They were organized into 7 platoons with light weapons. The heaviest weapons they possessed were 30-caliber machine guns. They did have one bazooka, but they did not have any rockets for it. In fact, they were low on ammunition and had had very little sleep, since they had been fighting constantly over the preceding 10 days. On the night of December 27, 1958, the advance unit of Guevara's force arrived at the outskirts of the city. They were followed by a convoy of confiscated trucks and jeeps, led with Guevara's experienced guerrilla from the Sierra Maestra. The guerrillas of the rebel organization called the Revolutionary Directorate, which had joined forces with him in the 86 CheGuevara Escambray Mountains, and new recruits, students and peasants, who had been recently trained at Guevara's base camp in the mountains. The convoy took a little used back road that brought them to the provincial university campus on the edge of the city. Guevara initially established his command center there and later moved it into the center. On the 28th, he sent his units to capture strategic points in the city, while the Revolutionary Directorate's units laid siege to the garrison of the Rural Guards. Aleida March was constantly at Guevara's side. She knew the city's street pattern well, and was able to guide him and his men through the city as they attacked one after another of the positions held by the army units and the police defending the city. She also was able to help him gain support from the local population. As they moved toward the center of Santa Clara, they often had to dodge bullets as they ran from building to building. March 85. Both of them later recalled how frightened they were the other one would be harmed, when at one particularly dangerous moment, they had to run across a street in front of an army tank that was shooting in their direction. Guevara was concerned about both the army units stationed on a hill called El Capiro, overlooking the city and the armored train with some 400 soldiers and heavy weapons that was stationed on the railway tracks below them. Thus, the units on the hill and the armored train were strategic targets for Guevara's units. He had his men bring a bulldozer from the School of Agronomy at the university to remove 30 feet of rails from the railway line so that the train would be derailed if it attempted to move from its position below the hill. Guevara ordered his suicide squad, led by 18-year-old Roberto Rodriguez, nicknamed the Cowboy Kid, to capture the hill. They succeeded in dislodging the soldiers from the hill and started to attack the train, which withdrew toward the middle of town in the direction where the rails had been removed. As Guevara planned, the train was derailed as it attempted to FLE with its cargo of troops, weapons, and ammunition. According to his account, at this point, a very interesting battle ensued. The men in the armored train had been dislodged by our Molotov cocktails, but in spite of their excellent protection, they were prepared to fight GHT only at long range. Harassed by our men who, from nearby train carriages and other close-range positions, were hurling bot LCHE 87 tireless of FL aiming gasoline, the train, thanks to its armor plate, became a veritable oven for its soldiers. After several hours, the entire crew surrendered, with their 22 armored cars, their anti-aircraft guns, their DCA machine guns, and their fabulous quantities of ammunition. Fabulous, that is, to us. Guevara 1968-252. Actually, Guevara's account is too modest since it was he who personally negotiated the surrender of the soldiers on the train by meeting unarmed with their commander, and assuring them he would allow them to return to Havana escorted by the Red Cross after they laid down their arms. Tabo. 244. As word went through the city of the surrender of the troops on the train, the citizenry began barricading the streets with cars and buses in order to obstruct the movement of the army's tanks and armored cars. Batista ordered the Air Force to bomb and strafe the city, which it did repeatedly. But even though many buildings were reduced to rubble, and the civilian population was terrorized by the Air Force's indiscriminate bombing and strafe of the city, the situation could not be reversed. After the troops on the train surrendered, the large number of police and 4 army tanks that were defending the main police station were persuaded to surrender by one of Guevara's officers. In the fighting leading up to the surrender of the police station, the Cowboy Kid was killed. The rural guards garrison capitulated to the Revolutionary Directorate FIGHTers with the aid of some of Guevara's units, which used some of the heavy weapons confiscated from the armored train. And then, according to Guevara, the prison, the courthouse, and the provincial government headquarters fell to us, as well as the Grand Hotel, where the besieged men continued their fire from the 10th FL or almost until the cessation of hostilities. Page 253. By New Year's Day 1959, Guevara's forces had gained control of the city, except for someone, 000 soldiers inside the Leoncio Vidal Army garrison, the largest military installation in central Cuba. Guevara had been concerned they might attempt to mount a counterattack on his forces, and he had directed most of his units to concentrate on the garrison and begin to assault it. However, as the news of the surrenders in Santa Clara reached Havana, the dictator Batista and his immediate family, fled the country. Informed of this, the commander of the garrison contacted Guevara about negotiating an indefinite truce. After consulting with Castro, Guevara met with the commander of the garrison and told him the 88 CheGuevara following. It's either unconditional surrender or fire, but real fire and with no quarter. The city is already in our hands. At 12:30 p.m., I will give the order to resume the attack using all our forces. We will take the bar racks at all costs. You will be responsible for the bloodshed. Tabo, 253. The commander went back to talk to his officers, but the soldiers were already deserting their positions and fraternizing with Guevara's men. They began to throw their weapons down and walk unarmed over to the rebel lines. The battle for Santa Clara was over. Guevara's troops allowed the surrendered soldiers to leave Santa Clara, unarmed, and return to Havana via the port city of Cabarrien. Over Radio Rebelda, Castro demanded the surrender of the besieged garrison in Santiago, and he ordered Guevara and Cienfuegos to march their columns immediately to Havana. He gave Guevara orders to take over La Cabaña fortress, which dominates the entrance to Havana and its harbor, and he gave Cienfuegos orders to occupy the Camp Columbia barracks, which was the most important garrison of Batista's army. On January 2, 1959, they left in a convoy of trucks and jeeps for Havana. On the way to Havana, Guevara made his Fi Arresti declaration of love for Aleida when the convoy stopped for gas, and they found themselves alone for a moment. He told her that he realized he was in love with her in Santa Clara, when they had to cross the street almost directly in front of the tank that was firing in their direction. He told her he couldn't bear the thought of something happening to her. March 2008, 85. In the early morning hours of January 3, 1959, Guevara and Cienfuegos arrived with their columns in Havana. According to Aleida's AC count of their arrival at the imposing La Cabaña fortress overlooking the city. In such a fortress, it was strange to observe how the mass of soldiers subordinated themselves to the rebel command without any kind of opposition. This fact revealed a great deal about the moral breakdown of the dictatorship, but above all else about the trust and respect for the new rebel army, which had the unconditional support of the people. Page 95. Meanwhile, Castro marched with his troops to Santiago de Cuba to capture the Moncada, the fortress where he had made an abortive attempt 6 years earlier to bring down the Batista regime. On January 5, 5 Latin American countries recognized Castro's provisional government. Great Britain and a number of other nations soon followed. On LCHE 89, January 7, the United States recognized the new government and recalled Ambassador Earl Smith, who was unanimously condemned by Cuban public opinion for having supported Batista. On January 8, Castro's column arrived in Havana, where Guevara and Cienfuegos awaited him. As Fidel triumphantly rode into the city, his brother Raul was at his right and Guevara was at his left. In less than 3 years, the young Argentine had risen from the obscure existence of a roving young adventurer to become one of the most popular and important leaders in the Cuban Revolution. 3 years earlier, he had only begun to think seriously about his political convictions and commitments. But now, at the age of 31, he found himself an accomplished military commander and one of the 3 most powerful leaders in the new government of Cuba. While historical circumstances, destiny, or fate, call it what you will, must be given some of the credit for Guevara's meteoric rise to fame and power, the importance of the man's personality must not be underrated. By the time he arrived in Havana, Che seems to have acquired all the characteristics of a true revolutionary and charismatic leader. He demonstrated an amazing capacity for personal sacrifice, and he never compromised his ideals. From the time he became a guerrilla, he appears to have lived according to the motto to do o nada, all or nothing. In fact, he was so demanding of himself that he did not permit himself a single indulgence. This, of course, made it possible for him to demand a great deal from those around him. Che had that quality of personal magnetism that attracts and inspires the loyalty and devotion of others. In the Sierra Maestra, his bravery, boldness, and determination invoked the enthusiasm of his comrades, and it soon became clear to Castro that Guevara was a natural leader. Once having elevated him to a position of leadership, Castro found that Che was an extremely capable and resourceful military commander. He gave him increasingly greater responsibilities, and in the end, entrusted him with the most important and crucial campaign of the Revolutionary War. Castro had complete confidence in Guevara, since he knew that he had no personal political ambitions. He recognized that as an Argentine, Guevara felt it was not his place to question the basic political objectives 90 CheGuevara chosen by his Cuban comrades. Castro knew that he could count on Guevara's loyalty and unquestioning devotion to the goals of the revolutionary movement. Their relationship was very close, largely because of the similarity of their thinking, and he soon gave Guevara some of the most important positions of leadership in the new revolutionary regime.
Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe.